From the Fox News Podcast Network, I'm Dana Perino, and everything will be okay. Hello and welcome back. Last week, we spoke to Olympic gymnast, mother, and author Shannon Miller, and she was so inspiring when talking about finding your passion, taking the risk to see your goals come to fruition, and she gave me tips on how to get back into my headstand practice, and I am putting those to good use. My guest this week is someone who is constantly setting new and ambitious goals for himself.
Before you can do the big thing, you have to get the basics right. This means making good personal decisions a habit, being thoughtful about your choices, embracing the decision-making that comes with adulthood. Instilling personal discipline over your choices is a way to find more freedom. How? Well, if you have a code that you live by or a goal you're trying to reach, then decisions that would help you keep your code and achieve your goals are easier to make.
Ben Shapiro is the host of The Ben Shapiro Show and editor-in-chief of DailyWire.com. He is the author of multiple New York Times bestsellers and is releasing a new book called The Authoritarian Moment: How the Left Weaponized America's Institutions Against Dissent. We discuss the thinking behind Ben's new book, and he shares his advice on speaking your mind, the flaws in the modern-day hiring system, and as a husband and father of three, we explore how he manages a work-life balance. Ben, I have so much to talk to you about, but I want to start with your latest book, The Authoritarian Moment: How the Left Weaponized America's Institutions Against Dissent. Maybe just give us a synopsis here of the book, and then I'm going to ask you about when you find time to write it.
So the basic idea of the book is that more and more Americans, and this is true for everyone on every side of the political aisle, with the exception of people on the radical left, feels as though they are not allowed to say what they actually believe in everyday life. If they put it on Facebook, they're afraid their friends are going to treat them poorly, or that their employer is going to fire them or suspend them or call them in for a talk. They're afraid that if they say what they think at church, even church leaders will get uptight with them. They believe, I think correctly, that the major institutions in American society are weaponized against them. And what the book really is about is how that came to be, why they're not wrong, why so many Americans are correct to believe that these institutions have been taken over by a pretty radical core of hardcore leftists, and why it is that so many people acquiesce to that, and then how we can push back against that.
It seems it's so interesting. Have you noticed that, like, you wrote this book, but then it's like the left, some of the authors from the left or columnists are writing about the authoritarian moment and saying it's the right that wants authoritarianism. Have you noticed that?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yep. And that was one of the things that I wanted to write about as well, is there is this take on the left that there's this rising authoritarian right that is interested in government running all of our lives, or is interested in perverting the institutions of democracy. And they use as their sort of case in point the evils of January 6th. And as I point out in the book, January 6th was an act of evil. I mean, it was a bunch of rioters who were attempting to stop the processes of democracy from moving forward as constitutionally mandated. And that was really terrible. It was a riot. And then the rioters were all arrested. The House was cleared. And then Republicans, led by Mike Pence, actually certified the election. Mitch McConnell obviously went out there and ripped on the rioters as well. And that was pretty much it, right? It was all Republican secretaries of state in places like Arizona and Pennsylvania and Georgia that were certifying these elections. But meanwhile, it was within the next week that the left basically decided that the evils of January 6th required them to get quite authoritarian in their response. So you saw Parler, for example, knocked completely offline by Amazon Web Services on the grounds that Parler had been used to plan the events of January 6th. Well, what the data actually showed is that Facebook and Twitter were used more to plan the events of January 6th than Parler, but there was no retaliation by Amazon Web Services against either of those outlets. You didn't see a mass call by the right for the quashing and censorship of the left having to do with November 4th, but you did see that in the aftermath of January 6th from a wide variety of Democratic sources. You had Democratic Congress people who are sitting there talking about how we might need to revise how we think about misinformation and freedom of the press in the United States. And now, obviously, we have the president of the United States openly admitting that he's doing something he knows to be unconstitutional in this new eviction moratorium, but he's going to do it anyway because, hell, it may be worth it. So, if we're talking about authoritarian tendencies. That does exist on all sides. But when it comes to who actually has the levers of power to effectuate this sort of top-down authoritarianism, quashing of dissent, it is the left, not the right.
What does history tell us about these moments? Is there anything we can learn from that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the thing we can learn is that the people in the middle are the ones who get to decide what happens next. It's not the radicals on either side. It's the people in the middle who have to decide whether they are more interested in upholding the institutions of our democracy than they are in moving along with people they may agree with in terms of policy. So I think, for example, the moderate liberals are going to have to decide. They agree with many members of the left on sort of end goals, politically speaking, but they're going to have to decide whether they are willing to tell the radical left, listen, we may agree with you on that stuff, but we're going to put that off for the sake of having a common republic. We may get to where you want eventually, but it's going to be a little bit slower. But at least we're not going to be ditching individual rights and freedom of association and the ability of people to live with each other. Otherwise, you could see the center left say, okay, we'll move along with the left because we like your priorities. And if all this other stuff has to go out the window, then I guess we'll have to do that.
So people are getting ready to go back to school, concluding college, of course. And I get asked this question quite a bit when I do any sort of book events or speeches, and I don't have a good answer for them. So I thought I would ask you. And that is for people who are maybe worried that their children, and even if they're adult children at college, that they're afraid to speak their mind. They're afraid of the consequences of what could happen to them. And they ask me, like, what should I tell my kid? And sometimes I just don't know what to say. How do you answer that question?
So usually what I say is that you have to pick your spots. And I think this is true in virtually all of life. You have to decide the purposes of conversations when you enter into them. And when you're on a college campus, you have to decide who your audience is, what's the purpose of the conversation. So if you're in class and the teacher says something you don't like and you mouth off, that's fine. I mean, that's usually fine. When it comes to actually filling out the test, the only person who's going to be reading that test, presumably, is the teacher. You're not going to convince the professor of your particular point of view. So giving them baton to use against you seems like a really poor waste of time, a waste of resources. Now, I'm in sort of a running argument over this with my friends Dennis Prager and Jordan Peterson, both of whom say you should write exactly what you feel. But I will also note that there is an element of practicality here, and getting yourself, a C in philosophy because you wrote what you think as opposed to what the teacher wanted to hear is a misunderstanding of what colleges unfortunately have become, which is basically credentialing centers. And so long as they're credentialing centers, you're there for the credential, and handing the club to your opponent to hit you with doesn't seem like a smart idea.
You had it recently, I don't know how much you've talked about this publicly, though I do listen to the Ben Shapiro Show every day. You have some thoughts about education and university and who should be going. And we recently met this young woman, just as an example. She went to a state university out west. She got a degree in sports management, and she has $40,000 in student loan debt. She's now 30 years old. She's not at all working in sports management. She's working, has got a good job, full-time job, but working as a dispatcher for a large company that has a fleet of trucks. And I think about her, like, should we have encouraged her to get a degree and go $40,000 in debt for something that she was unlikely to do for a living? I mean, not everybody can be Jerry Maguire.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that what we have is a radical misalignment of how employers actually employ and how they hire people. So I think a lot of employers use your college degree as a sort of basic IQ and dedicated and test of dedication. That if you got through 4 years of higher education and you went to a really solid school, this means you are smart, and this means you're also capable of working hard. Well, I don't see why employers should have to base that on your performance in college. I think apprenticeship programs coming out of high school for a lot of folks would be significantly more useful. Now, that's not talking about people who are going to be engineers, or people who are going to be doctors, people who are going to be mathematicians, but it is talking about the vast majority of other people who, again, are not going to be English professors or really are not going to have careers in the theater arts. The truth is that how many sports agents actually went to school in sports agenting? The vast majority of sports agents that I know about are people who either went to law school or they're people who got into the business of sport, got to know a bunch of people who are athletes, and then said, what if I rep you? And that's true, I think, for most people. Most people don't know how to do a job until they actually go and do the job. So accelerating that would make a lot of sense. The problem is that the perverse incentive structure means that a lot of people are going to college who don't need to. Colleges have every intention of continuing to just
For the full podcast, go to foxnewspodcast.com.